All right, so this is our first bonus learning objective that has a video, so this is 6.22. All right, we're going to talk about domain of a different type of function. So recall that domain, we learned early on in unit 6, domain is the values that you're allowed to plug in. It's all the x values you're allowed to plug into your function. Specifically, we saw with a rational function, we just made sure we didn't divide by 0. So we did stuff with the denominator and made sure it wasn't 0. In a previous unit, we learned about square roots, right? The square root of 4 is 2 and all that. And one important thing we learned about square roots is you cannot take the square root of a negative number when you're dealing with real numbers. And if we're talking about graphing and plugging things in, we're talking about real numbers. If we're talking about solutions to equations, then we can talk about complex numbers. So if we had the square root of negative 4 with real numbers, this does not exist. With complex numbers, this would be 2i. All right, so we're talking about real numbers in this case, so you can't take the square root of a negative. All right, so what is the domain of f of x equals the square root of x? Just the basic square root function, what x values you're allowed to plug in. Well, we just said you cannot plug in a negative, but everything else is fine. So we have to make sure x is bigger than or equal to 0. You can take the square root of 0, that's just 0. So 0 works and all the positive works, but we can't take the square root of a negative. So this is my domain. It's all the x's that are bigger than or equal to 0. All right, so that's all we have to do for this problem. What about this problem? All right, what is the domain of the square root of 3x plus 1? Similar to with rationals, with a rational, whatever the denominator was, we had to make sure it wasn't 0. For our square roots, we have to make sure whatever is in the square root, we need to make sure this is not negative. Because if it's negative, then we run into a problem with complex numbers and all that. So for this square root problem, we're going to take 3x plus 1. We want to make sure it's not negative. Another way to say not negative is that it's bigger than or equal to 0. And then we just have to solve this inequality. So we subtract 1 first, and then divide by 3. So as long as x is bigger than or equal to negative 1/3, this square root is going to make sense. So the domain is all the x's bigger than or equal to negative 1/3. Right. Pretty simple. For all these problems, you just do the same thing. All right, here there's a lot more going on with this problem. There's this extra 2 and there's 3. The only thing that can actually go wrong is inside the square root is if this ends up being negative. So even though there's more going on in this problem, there's no extra step you have to do. You just take 5x minus 2 and you make sure it's bigger than or equal to 0. So we add 2 to both sides and divide by 5. So as long as x is bigger than or equal to 2/5, we're good. So our domain is everything that's bigger than or equal to 2/5. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. What is the domain of this function? And again, all that matters is that whatever we're taking the square root of is non-negative. So it's always take whatever's in the square root and set it bigger than or equal to 0. So it's always your first step. Solve that inequality and then write it in your squiggly brackets because it's a domain. All right, the most common mistake students forget is just forgetting the equal sign. All right, so it's greater than or equal because 0 is fine for square roots. 0 is not fine for division. All right, so one thing to kind of keep track of. 0, bad for fractions. All right, it's good for square roots because you can't take the square root of 0. All right, so to demonstrate mastery of this topic, you're going to complete a skill check. The skill check will just have 2 square root domain problems. Oh, it's also going to have 2 previously covered domain problems. So this kind of skill check is going to check to make sure that you have kind of a well-rounded understanding of domain. So it'll be 2 new square root problems and also 2 previously covered ones. So probably one rational where you have to set the bottom equal to 0 or not equal to 0, however you want to think about it. And then one other previously covered domain problem. So this skill check is kind of a review of all the domain problems we've done so far.